Blood dripped from Paige Forrest's wounded shoulder as she staggered through the punishing heat of the Texas desert, each step driving her deeper into a wilderness that seemed eager to claim her life. The year was 1876, and the promise of a new beginning in the West had become nothing but a cruel joke that left her fleeing for her life with nothing but the torn clothes on her back and the haunting memories of everything she had lost. Paige had been walking for nearly 2 days since escaping from the men who had murdered her father and burned their homestead to the ground. The outlaws had taken everything: her family, her home, her dignity, and now the unforgiving landscape of West Texas seemed determined to take what little remained of her life. Her cracked lips parted as she caught sight of a town shimmering in the distance like a mirage. Presidio. The border town represented her last hope, though she wasn't sure she deserved even that much. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Paige stumbled toward the town's outskirts. Her vision blurred, the world tilting precariously as her knees finally buckled. As darkness closed in around her, she caught a glimpse of a tall figure approaching on horseback, the silhouette of a man against the burning sky, before she collapsed completely into the unforgiving dirt. Quentin Hayes pulled back on his horse's reins when he spotted the woman falling to the ground. At 32, he had seen his fair share of death and suffering during his years as a Texas Ranger, but something about the slight figure lying motionless in the dirt made him dismount faster than usual. His spurs jangled as his boots hit the ground, dust rising around him as he approached the woman. Her face was burned from the sun, her clothes torn and bloodied. When he knelt beside her, he could see the wound on her shoulder had been poorly bandaged with a strip of fabric that was now soaked through with blood and dirt. She was alive, but barely. "Madam," Quentin said, gently turning her over. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with matted chestnut hair and features that might have been beautiful if not marred by exhaustion and injury. He reached for his canteen, carefully lifting her head to drip some water between her parched lips. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing hazel eyes clouded with pain and fear. She tried to push herself away from him, a weak attempt that only demonstrated how little strength she had left. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not going to hurt you." "Leave me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm not worth saving." Something in those broken words struck Quentin to his core. He had heard similar sentiments from those who had given up, who had been beaten down by life until they believed themselves beyond redemption. He had felt it himself in the darkest moments after the war when the nightmares wouldn't let him sleep, and the whiskey couldn't dull the pain. "Then you'll be my greatest rescue," he replied without hesitation, his voice firm with conviction. He carefully lifted her onto his horse, mounting behind her to keep her from falling as he turned toward Presidio. She was light in his arms, too light, as if the hardships she had endured had whittled away not just her hope but her very substance. Her head lolled against his chest as consciousness slipped away from her once more. The main street of Presidio was quiet as Quentin rode in, the afternoon heat having driven most sensible folk indoors. The border town had grown considerably in recent years, sitting as it did along the Rio Grande across from its Mexican sister city. It wasn't as lawless as it had once been, but it still wasn't the kind of place where folks asked too many questions. Quentin headed straight for Doc Wilson's place, a small but tidy building with a shingle that read "Physician" hanging above the door. He dismounted carefully, gathering the unconscious woman in his arms before kicking at the door with his boot. The door swung open to reveal the doctor, an older man with spectacles perched on his nose and sleeves rolled up to his elbows. "Quentin Hayes," the doctor said, eyebrows rising as he took in the burden in the former ranger's arms. "What have you brought me this time?" "Found her collapsed outside of town," Quentin explained, following the doctor inside. "She's been shot, and she's been walking in this heat for who knows how long." Doc Wilson cleared off an examination table with a sweep of his arm. "Set her down here and wait outside." Quentin placed Paige carefully on the table but didn't move toward the door. "I'll stay if it's all the same to you." The doctor gave him a curious look but didn't argue. He had known Quentin long enough to recognize when the man had made up his mind. "Hand me those scissors, then. I need to see this wound properly." As the doctor cut away the makeshift bandage and the torn fabric of her dress around the wound, Quentin stood back, his hat in his hands. The woman had clearly been through hell, and something about her struck a chord within him. Maybe it was those defeated words, "I'm not worth saving," that resonated with the ghosts of his own past. "Bullet went clean through," Doc Wilson muttered as he examined the wound. "She's lucky it didn't hit anything vital, but infection's setting in. She's also severely dehydrated and exhausted." He looked up at Quentin. "She's going to need care for several days at least. The hotel's full up with that cattle buyer convention. Where do you plan on taking her?" Quentin hadn't thought that far ahead, but the answer came to him without hesitation. "My place. I've got the room." Doc Wilson's eyebrows rose even higher. In the 5 years since Quentin had settled in Presidio after leaving the Rangers, he had kept largely to himself, running his small horse ranch outside of town and rarely inviting anyone into his personal space. "Are you sure about that?" the doctor asked. "I'm sure," Quentin replied, his eyes never leaving the unconscious woman's face. "Just tell me what she needs." 2 hours later, Quentin carried Paige into his modest home on the outskirts of Presidio. The ranch house wasn't large, but it was well built and clean, with a spare bedroom that had rarely seen use. He had fresh washed linens on the bed, having prepared it while the doctor had finished treating Paige and giving her laudanum for the pain. He laid her gently on the bed, careful of her bandaged shoulder. Doc Wilson had cleaned and stitched the wound, given her medicine for the fever that was threatening, and provided Quentin with detailed instructions for her care. Now, in the soft light of the lamp, Quentin could see her features more clearly. Despite the sunburn and exhaustion, she was indeed beautiful, with delicate features and long eyelashes that cast shadows on her cheeks. Quentin pulled a chair beside the bed, settling in for what would likely be a long night. He had promised the doctor he would watch for signs of worsening fever, changing the cool cloths on her forehead and giving her water when she was able to take it. It had been years since he'd cared for anyone but himself, and the responsibility sat awkwardly on his shoulders. As night deepened outside the window, Paige stirred, moaning softly in her sleep. Her brow furrowed as if she were caught in a nightmare, and Quentin found himself reaching out to smooth a strand of hair from her face. "You're safe now," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "Whatever you're running from, it can't reach you here." Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing those hazel eyes again, now hazy with fever and medication. She looked at him without recognition, fear flickering across her features. "Where am I?" she whispered. "My home, outside Presidio," Quentin replied. "My name's Quentin Hayes. I found you collapsed on the outskirts of town. Doc Wilson patched you up, but you need rest to recover." She tried to sit up but gasped at the pain in her shoulder, falling back against the pillows. "Easy," Quentin cautioned, reaching for the cup of water on the bedside table. "Here, you need to drink." He helped her take a few sips, supporting her head with a gentleness that belied his weathered appearance. She drank eagerly, the water clearly a relief to her parched throat. "Thank you," she said when she'd finished, her voice a little stronger. "I'm Paige." "Paige Forrest, Miss Forrest," Quentin acknowledged with a nod. "Do you remember what happened to you?" A shadow crossed her face and she turned away. "I remember enough to know I should have died out there." "That's not how I see it," Quentin replied quietly. "Whatever brought you to that point, it wasn't your time. You don't know what I've done," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What I've lost." "No, I don't," he agreed. "But I know something about wanting to give up, and I know something about finding reasons to keep going." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if trying to read his story in the lines of his face. Whatever she saw there seemed to quiet some of the fear in her eyes. "Rest now," Quentin said, reaching for the bottle of laudanum the doctor had left. "More talk tomorrow when you're stronger." He measured out the dose as instructed and helped her take it. As the medicine began to take effect, her eyelids grew heavy once more. "Why are you helping me?" she murmured, already drifting back toward sleep. Quentin considered his answer carefully. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," he finally said. "Even those who don't believe they do." As Paige slipped back into sleep, Quentin settled deeper into his chair. Outside, the wind whispered through the mesquite trees, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. It was going to be a long night, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, Quentin didn't mind the prospect of the hours ahead. The first rays of dawn were filtering through the curtains when Paige woke again, her mind clearer but her body aching with every movement. She found herself alone in the unfamiliar room, though she could hear movement elsewhere in the house. The events of the previous day came back to her in fragments: the endless walking, the collapse, the deep voice promising rescue. She took stock of her situation. Her shoulder was professionally bandaged, the wound cleaned and stitched. Someone had removed her filthy, torn dress and replaced it with a clean, oversized shirt that she assumed belonged to her rescuer. The thought made her flush with embarrassment, though she was still wearing her undergarments beneath it. The door opened slowly, and Quentin appeared carrying a tray. He hesitated when he saw she was awake, as if uncertain of his welcome. "Morning," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Brought you some breakfast. Nothing fancy, just some oatmeal and coffee." Paige tried to sit up, wincing at the pain that shot through her shoulder. Quentin set the tray down quickly and moved to help her, placing extra pillows behind her back to prop her up. "Thank you," she said, feeling strangely vulnerable under his gaze. Now that her mind was clearer, she could see him properly for the first time. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years outdoors. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and eyes the color of a stormy sky. His dark hair was a little too long, as if he hadn't bothered with a barber in some time. "How are you feeling?" he asked, handing her the bowl of oatmeal. "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," she admitted, attempting a small smile that felt foreign on her face. "But better than yesterday," Quentin nodded, pulling the chair closer to the bed. "Doc Wilson will be by later to check on you. He says you're lucky the bullet went clean through without hitting anything important." Paige's hand trembled slightly as she took a spoonful of oatmeal. The simple food tasted better than anything she could remember, her body desperately needing the nourishment. "I don't know how to thank you," she said after several bites. "You saved my life." "No need for thanks," Quentin replied, looking somewhat uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Paige said with certainty. "Not everyone would." She hesitated, then added softly, "I meant what I said yesterday. I'm not worth the trouble." Quentin's expression hardened slightly. "I meant what I said too, and I'll be the judge of what's worth my trouble." They fell into silence as Paige continued eating, though it wasn't entirely uncomfortable. There was something about Quentin Hayes that made her feel safe, despite her instinct to trust no one. Perhaps it was the way he kept his distance while still making it clear he was there to help. Or maybe it was the lack of pity in his eyes. He looked at her with concern, yes, but also with a respect that had been absent from most men's gazes throughout her life. "Where are you from, Miss Forrest?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. Paige set down her spoon, the memories washing over her like a cold wave. "My father and I had a small homestead about 2 days' ride from here. Before that, we came from Missouri." She swallowed hard. "There's nothing left for me there now. And the men who shot you," she looked up sharply. "How did you know it was men?" "Wasn't hard to figure," Quentin replied. "Bullet wound, a woman alone in the desert looking like she'd been through hell. Someone was after you." Paige's hand tightened around the coffee cup. "They called themselves the Callahan Gang, 6 of them. They wanted our land because there's a spring on our property. When my father refused to sell, they—" Her voice broke and she closed her eyes against the memories. "They killed him, burned everything. I managed to get away, but not before one of them shot me." Quentin's expression darkened. The Callahans, I've heard of them. Led by brothers from Oklahoma, moved into these parts a few years back. They've been causing trouble all through this region. You know of them? Paige asked, a flicker of hope igniting within her. I was a Texas Ranger for 8 years before I settled here, Quentin explained. I still hear things, keep my ear to the ground. A ranger, Paige repeated, looking at him with new understanding. That explained the quiet competence, the watchfulness in his gaze. Do you think they'll come looking for me? Quentin considered this. Hard to say. If they think you died out there, maybe not. But if they know you got away. He left the thought unfinished. The implications hung heavy in the air. Paige set down her coffee cup, her appetite suddenly gone. I should leave as soon as possible. I don't want to bring trouble to your door. You're not going anywhere until that shoulder heals, Quentin stated firmly. And even then, you need a plan. Running blind is what nearly got you killed in the desert. I don't have anywhere to go, Paige admitted, the reality of her situation crashing down on her anew. No family, no money, nothing. Then you'll stay here until we figure something out, Quentin said, as if it were the simplest decision in the world. My home is secure and I can protect you if need be. Paige stared at him, bewildered by his offer. You don't even know me. Why would you risk yourself like this? Quentin was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the window. I've seen too many good people suffer at the hands of men like the Callahans, and I've spent too many years turning a blind eye to things I should have stopped. He looked back at her. Maybe helping you is a way of setting something right. The honesty in his voice struck Paige deeply. She sensed there was more to his story, wounds that ran as deep as her own, though of a different nature. Before she could respond, a wave of exhaustion swept over her, the simple act of eating and talking having drained her limited energy. Quentin noticed immediately. You need more rest. Doc said you'd be weak for several days. He stood, taking the tray. Sleep. No one will harm you here. As he moved toward the door, Paige called softly, Mr. Hayes. He turned, eyebrows raised in question. Thank you, she said simply. Not just for the rescue, but for believing I'm worth it. Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. He nodded once and left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. Paige sank back against the pillows, her mind whirling with the strange turn her life had taken. Yesterday, she had been ready to die in the desert, convinced that death was the only escape from the pain and loss that had become her existence. Today, she was lying in a stranger's bed, being cared for by a former Texas Ranger who seemed determined to save her whether she wanted saving or not. As sleep began to claim her once more, Paige wondered if perhaps her life hadn't ended in that desert after all, but was instead taking an unexpected new direction. It was a dangerous thought, laden with hope she wasn't sure she could afford. But as the soft sounds of Quentin moving about the house reached her ears, she allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that maybe, just maybe, she might be worth saving after all. Over the next several days, Paige's strength gradually returned. Doc Wilson visited daily, checking her wound and expressing satisfaction with her progress. The fever had broken completely by the 3rd day, and the infection that had threatened had been successfully fought off with the doctor's medicines and Quentin's diligent care. Quentin himself remained something of a mystery to Paige. He was unfailingly kind and attentive to her needs, but he spoke little about himself, deflecting personal questions with brief answers or changes of subject. What she did learn came in small pieces. He had left the Rangers 5 years ago. He ran a modest horse breeding operation, and he lived alone by choice, though he seemed to be respected in town. By the end of the first week, Paige was able to move around the house with Quentin's assistance. His home was simple but comfortable, with solid furniture, clean lines, and very few personal touches. The main room combined a kitchen and living space, with a stone fireplace at one end, and bookshelves lining one wall surprisingly well stocked with volumes ranging from practical guides on horsemanship to poetry and philosophy. You're a reader, Paige observed one afternoon as she ran her fingers along the spines of the books while Quentin prepared coffee. "Helps pass the time," he replied, bringing 2 mugs to the table. "Gets quiet out here. Did you always like books, or was it something you came to later?" she asked, selecting a volume of Whitman's poetry and leafing through it carefully. Quentin's lips quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "My mother was a schoolteacher back in Pennsylvania. She believed education was the key to a better life. Made sure I had books even when we didn't have much else." "She sounds like a wise woman," Paige said, joining him at the table. "Is she still in Pennsylvania?" A shadow passed over Quentin's face. "She died when I was 16, consumption." "I'm sorry," Paige said softly. "My mother died when I was 12, childbirth. The baby didn't survive either." Their eyes met in shared understanding of that particular type of loss. For a moment, the barriers between them seemed to thin. "That why you came west with your father?" Quentin asked. Paige nodded. "He couldn't bear to stay in Missouri after we lost them, said we needed a fresh start. We tried farming in Kansas first, but the droughts were bad. Then we heard about land in Texas." She traced the rim of her coffee mug with her finger. "He was a good man, my father. Not perfect, but he tried his best with me." "What was he like?" Quentin asked, and Paige was struck by the genuine interest in his voice, as if he truly wanted to know about the man whose death had set her on this path. "Strong," she said after a moment's thought. "Not just physically, though he was that too. He had this steadiness about him, like a rock that wouldn't be moved no matter how hard the river pushed." She smiled faintly at the memory. "He loved to sing, though he wasn't very good at it, and he could make anything grow, even in the worst soil. He used to say he had a deal with the plants. He'd give them water, and they'd give him life." Quentin listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face. There was something about his focused attention that made Paige feel truly heard, perhaps for the first time since her father's death. "He sounds like a man worth knowing," Quentin said when she fell silent. "He was," Paige agreed, blinking back unexpected tears. "They had no right to take him from this world." Quentin's hand tightened around his coffee mug. "No, they didn't. Men like the Callahans take what they want without thought for who gets hurt in the process." "You speak like you know them personally," Paige observed. "Not the Callahans specifically," Quentin replied, his gaze turning distant. "But men like them. Men who believe power gives them the right to destroy lives." He seemed to catch himself then, shaking his head slightly as if to dispel unwanted memories. "But that's another story." Paige wanted to press, to learn what lay behind the shadows in his eyes, but something told her he wasn't ready to share that part of himself yet. Instead, she asked, "Will you tell me about your horses? I saw them from the window, but I haven't been outside yet." Relief flickered across Quentin's face at the change of subject. "They're mostly quarter horses. Good for working cattle, strong and smart. I breed and train them, sell them to ranches mostly, though sometimes to the army or private buyers." As he spoke about his horses, his demeanor changed subtly. The tension eased from his shoulders, and his voice took on a warmth that had been absent before. Paige found herself watching the animation in his face, the way his hands moved as he described a particularly promising colt or the intelligence of his lead mare. "You love them," she said when he paused. "They're honest creatures," Quentin replied. "No pretense, no deception. They give back exactly what you put in." "Unlike people," Paige added quietly. Quentin's eyes met hers. "Some people are worth the risk." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning neither of them was quite ready to explore. Paige looked away first, suddenly aware of the quickening of her heartbeat. "Doc Wilson says I should try walking outside tomorrow," she said, changing the subject. "Maybe you could show me your horses then." "I'd like that," Quentin agreed, a hint of warmth in his voice that made Paige's cheeks flush. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect spring day in the high desert. After breakfast, Quentin offered his arm to Paige as they stepped outside for the first time since her arrival. The sunlight was bright after days confined indoors, and she blinked as her eyes adjusted. Quentin's property spread out before them, not a large ranch by Texas standards, but substantial enough. The house sat on a gentle rise with a barn and corral below. A small creek ran along one edge of the property, feeding a stand of cottonwood trees that provided shade. Beyond, the land opened up to grassland dotted with mesquite and cactus, rolling away toward distant hills. "It's beautiful," Paige said, breathing deeply of the clean air. She was wearing a simple dress that Doc Wilson's wife had brought over, saying it belonged to their daughter who was away teaching in San Antonio. It was a bit loose on Paige's frame, which had grown thin during her ordeal, but it felt wonderful to be properly dressed again. "Not much compared to some spreads," Quentin said, "but it's enough for me." "It's perfect," Paige replied honestly. After the cramped homestead she'd shared with her father, Quentin's ranch seemed expansive and peaceful. They walked slowly toward the corral where several horses grazed or dozed in the morning sun. As they approached, a gorgeous bay mare raised her head, ears pricking forward with interest. "That's Penny," Quentin said, a note of pride in his voice. "My best mare. She's the foundation of my breeding stock." Penny approached the fence, her intelligent eyes curious as she assessed Paige. The horse stretched her neck over the rail, sniffing at Paige's outstretched hand. "She's magnificent," Paige said, stroking the mare's velvety nose. "My father always wanted a good horse, but we could never afford more than our old plow horse." "She seems to like you," Quentin observed as Penny leaned into Paige's touch. "She's usually more cautious with strangers." "I've always had a way with animals," Paige said, smiling as the mare lipped at her fingers. "They sense things about people, I think." They spent the next hour walking the property, Quentin pointing out features and explaining his operation. He had 4 brood mares, 2 young geldings he was training to sell, and the pride of his stable, a handsome black stallion named Thunder who watched them regally from the far side of the pasture. By the time they returned to the house, Paige was tired but invigorated. The fresh air and exercise had brought color to her cheeks, and for the first time since her rescue, she felt truly alive. "Thank you for showing me around," she said as they settled on the porch, where Quentin had brought them glasses of cool water. "It feels good to be outside again." "You look better for it," Quentin replied, his eyes taking in the healthy flush of her skin. "More like yourself." "I'm not sure I know who that is anymore," Paige admitted, looking out toward the distant hills. "Everything that defined me is gone now, not everything," Quentin said quietly. "You're still here, still fighting, am I?" she asked, turning to face him. "I was ready to die in that desert, remember, if you hadn't come along." "But I did," Quentin interrupted, "and now you have a choice about what comes next." "What choices does a woman alone have in this world?" Paige asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Especially one with nothing to her name." Quentin was silent for a long moment, considering her words. "There's work in town if you want it. The hotel needs help, last I heard, or the general store, Mrs. Abernathy was saying just last week that she needed someone with a good hand for accounts." "You'd help me find work?" Paige asked, surprised. "Why wouldn't I?" most men would expect. She trailed off, embarrassed, understanding dawned in Quentin's eyes. "I'm not most men, Miss Forrest. And I don't expect anything from you except that you heal and find your way forward." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Paige. In her experience, men who offered help usually wanted something in return. Her father had been the exception, and now, it seemed, so was Quentin Hayes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Quentin nodded, looking almost embarrassed by her gratitude. "We should head in. Doc Wilson will be by later, and you shouldn't overdo it on your first day up." As they returned to the house, Paige found herself studying Quentin's profile, wondering about the man who had so unexpectedly become her protector. There was a gentleness beneath his rugged exterior that intrigued her, along with a sadness she couldn't quite place. She found herself wanting to know more about him, to understand what had shaped him into the man who would rescue a stranger in the desert with no thought of reward. That evening, after Doc Wilson had pronounced himself satisfied with her progress, Paige sat by the fire while Quentin prepared a simple dinner of beans, bacon, and cornbread. The domestic scene felt strangely comfortable, as if they had fallen into a routine that had existed for years rather than days. "Doc says I'm healing well," Paige said as Quentin set a plate before her. "He thinks I could start helping around the house in another day or two." "There's no rush," Quentin replied, taking his seat across from her. "You need to regain your strength." "I'm not used to sitting idle," Paige admitted. "On the homestead, there was always work to be done. Father and I never stopped from sunrise to sunset." "Homesteading's hard work," Quentin agreed. "Takes a special kind of grit to carve a life from untamed land." "We were making progress," Paige said, the familiar ache of loss twisting in her chest. "The spring on our land meant we could grow things other homesteaders couldn't. Father said in another year or two we'd have been properly established." "That's why the Callahans wanted it," Quentin observed. "Water's more valuable than gold out here." Paige nodded, pushing her food around her plate as the memories surfaced. "They came 3 times before the attack. Each time offering to buy, each time the price was higher. But Father knew what the land was worth with that spring. He wouldn't sell. So they took it by force," Quentin concluded grimly. "They came at night," Paige continued, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Father heard them first, told me to hide in the root cellar. I heard the gunshots, the shouting, when I peeked out." She swallowed hard. "They'd shot him in the chest. He was still alive, trying to crawl away as they set fire to the cabin." Quentin's hand tightened around his fork, his knuckles whitening with tension. "You don't have to tell me this if it's too painful." "No, I need to say it," Paige insisted. "I need someone to know what happened." She took a shaky breath. "One of them found me as I tried to get to Father. He grabbed me, said they'd have some fun before finishing me off. I fought him, managed to get his gun. I shot him in the leg and ran. Another one fired at me. That's when I was hit in the shoulder. But I kept running into the darkness. I hid in a ravine until morning, then started walking." "You're braver than most men I've known," Quentin said quietly. "To survive that, to keep going." Paige shook her head. "Not brave, just scared and angry and too stubborn to lie down and die where they could find me." She met his gaze. "At least that's how it was until I collapsed. By then, I'd decided it didn't matter anymore." "And now?" Quentin asked, his eyes searching hers. "Now," Paige considered the question carefully. "Now I'm not sure what to think. Part of me still believes they took everything worth living for, but another part." "Another part?" Quentin prompted when she fell silent. Paige looked at him, really looked at him, the strength in his features, the compassion in his eyes, the quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from him. "Another part wonders if there might be reasons to keep going after all." Something shifted in Quentin's expression, a softening around his eyes that made Paige's heart beat a little faster. For a moment, it seemed he might reach across the table to take her hand, but instead he picked up his coffee cup. "I believe there are always reasons to keep going," he said. "Sometimes we just need help seeing them." The conversation turned to lighter topics as they finished their meal, but Paige felt something had changed between them. In sharing her darkest memories, she had forged a connection with this quiet, honorable man that went beyond gratitude or obligation. What that connection might mean, she wasn't yet sure. But for the first time since the attack, Paige found herself looking forward to tomorrow rather than dreading it. As the days passed, Paige's strength continued to return. She began helping around the house, at first with small tasks and then gradually taking on more. She discovered she enjoyed cooking for Quentin, watching with satisfaction as he appreciated her efforts with hearty appetite. They fell into a comfortable routine. Quentin would work with his horses in the morning while Paige prepared breakfast and tended to household chores. Then they would often eat lunch together before he returned to work in the afternoon. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch or by the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes talking. Paige learned that Quentin had joined the Rangers after serving in the Civil War, motivated by a desire to bring order to the chaotic post-war frontier. He spoke little of his time in the war, but from the few comments he made, Paige gathered it had left deep scars, both physical and emotional. 2 weeks after her rescue, Paige was hanging laundry in the yard when she saw a rider approaching from town. As the figure drew closer, she recognized Doc Wilson's daughter-in-law, Sarah, who had visited once before to bring some additional clothing for Paige. "Good morning," Sarah called, reining in her horse. She was a pretty woman in her late 20s with a friendly face and practical manner. "You're looking worlds better than when I last saw you." "I'm feeling much better, thank you," Paige replied, smiling as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Mr. Hayes has been very kind." "I can see that," Sarah said, dismounting and giving Paige a curious look. "The whole town's talking about it, you know. Quentin Hayes, the lone wolf, taking in a wounded woman and nursing her back to health. It's quite the story." Paige felt her cheeks warm. "I'm afraid I've imposed on him terribly." "Oh, I doubt he sees it that way," Sarah replied with a knowing smile. "Quentin's a good man, just keeps to himself usually. It's nice to see him with company." She reached into her saddlebag. "I brought you something from town. The ladies at the church heard about your situation and put together some things for you." She handed Paige a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside, Paige found a lovely green dress, a pair of sturdy boots that looked to be her size, and various personal items: a hairbrush, hairpins, a small bottle of rosewater, and even a modest amount of cash tucked into an envelope. I don't know what to say," Paige stammered, overwhelmed by the generosity. "Please thank everyone for me." "You can thank them yourself when you're ready to come to town," Sarah said, "which brings me to my other reason for visiting. The Mercantile is looking for someone to help with the books and serve customers. Mrs. Abernathy asked me to mention it to you if you're interested." Paige blinked in surprise. "She wants to offer me a job, but she doesn't even know me." "Quentin vouched for you," Sarah explained. "And that carries weight in Presidio. He doesn't give his approval easily." "He spoke to Mrs. Abernathy about me?" Paige asked, the news both touching and confusing her. Quentin hadn't mentioned anything about finding her work. "He's been in town several times in the past week," Sarah confirmed. "Talking to folks about possibilities for you, didn't he tell you?" "No," Paige said softly. "He didn't." Sarah studied her for a moment, then smiled. "Well, the offer's there when you're ready, no rush. Mrs. Abernathy said to take the time you need to heal properly." She glanced toward the barn where the sounds of Quentin working could be heard. "I should get back to town. Father-in-law needs these supplies before his next patient." After Sarah left, Paige stood holding the package, her mind whirling. Quentin had been quietly arranging a future for her, speaking to townspeople on her behalf, ensuring she would have options once she was fully recovered. The realization brought a lump to her throat. She was still standing there when Quentin emerged from the barn, leading one of the young geldings. He spotted her and raised a hand in greeting, his expression shifting to concern as he noted her stillness. "Everything all right?" he called, tethering the horse to a post and walking toward her. "Sarah Wilson was just here," Paige replied. "She brought gifts from the church ladies. And news that Mrs. Abernathy at the Mercantile might have a job for me." Quentin stopped a few feet away, his expression carefully neutral. "Ah, yes, I spoke with her a few days ago." "Why didn't you tell me?" Paige asked, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity. "Didn't want to pressure you," Quentin replied, shifting slightly. "Wasn't sure if you were ready to think about such things yet." Paige studied him, noting the discomfort in his posture. "You've been making arrangements for me, planning for when I leave." Something flashed across Quentin's face too quickly for Paige to interpret. "Just wanted you to have options," he said, his voice deliberately casual. "Figured you'd want your independence once you were healed." "Yes, of course," Paige agreed, though she felt an unexpected pang at the thought of leaving. "It was very thoughtful of you, thank you." Quentin nodded, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "You should try on that dress, make sure it fits." The abrupt change of subject wasn't lost on Paige, but she didn't press. Instead, she gathered the package and headed inside, aware of Quentin's gaze following her. Later that evening, after dinner, Paige decided to broach the subject again. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. She had worn the new green dress, and she hadn't missed the appreciative look in Quentin's eyes when she'd appeared in it for dinner. "I've been thinking about the job at the Mercantile," she began, watching him from the corner of her eye. "It sounds like a good opportunity." "Mrs. Abernathy's fair," Quentin agreed. "Pays well for honest work, and there's a room above the store you could rent." "So I could be completely self-sufficient," Paige said, testing his reaction. "That's the idea," Quentin replied, his voice neutral. "And you think I'm ready for that?" Quentin turned to look at her fully. "I think you're stronger than you know, but only you can decide when you're ready." Paige twisted her hands in her lap. "The truth is, I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not just of being on my own again, but of the Callahans. What if they find out I survived? What if they come looking for me?" Quentin's expression hardened. "Presidio's a safer place than most. Sheriff Ellis is a good man and he knows about your situation. And," he hesitated, "and I wouldn't be far away if you needed help." "You'd still watch out for me?" Paige asked, something warm unfurling in her chest at the thought. "Of course," Quentin said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Paige took a deep breath. "There's something else I've been thinking about, something I haven't told you." She met his gaze steadily. "The day before the Callahans attacked, I overheard them talking with a man in town. They were making plans not just for our land, but for others too. They mentioned maps, water rights, something about a railroad coming through. I think our spring was just part of a bigger scheme." Quentin straightened, his full attention on her now. "You're sure about this?" Paige nodded. "I told Father what I'd heard, but he said we shouldn't get involved, that it would only bring trouble. But now," she swallowed hard, "now I think I need to tell someone. If they're planning to hurt other homesteaders, someone should stop them." "Sheriff Ellis would be the one to tell," Quentin said, his voice thoughtful. "Though if the Callahans have bigger plans, they might have connections. Could be dangerous for you to speak up." "I know," Paige said quietly. "But I can't stay silent knowing they might do to others what they did to my father. I couldn't live with myself." Quentin studied her for a long moment, something like pride flickering in his eyes. "Then we'll go to Ellis together when you're ready. I'll stand with you." The simple declaration, "I'll stand with you," touched Paige deeply. In those 4 words, Quentin had offered not just protection but partnership, an acknowledgement that her fight was worth joining. "Thank you," she said softly, reaching out impulsively to lay her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his chair. Quentin looked startled by the contact, but he didn't pull away. Instead, after a moment's hesitation, he turned his hand over so that their palms met, his fingers curling gently around hers. They sat like that, hand in hand, as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared above the desert. Neither spoke, but in the silence, something new was growing between them, something fragile yet powerful, as unexpected as wildflowers after a desert rain. The next morning, Quentin announced that he needed to ride into town for supplies. "Would you like to come along?" He asked Paige over breakfast. "Might do you good to see Presidio properly instead of just hearing about it." Paige hesitated, torn between her desire to venture out and her fear of being recognized. "Do you think it's safe?" "I'll be with you," Quentin said simply. "And it's market day town will be busy. Easy to blend in with the crowd." The prospect of going to town both excited and terrified Paige, but she recognized it as a necessary step toward reclaiming her life. "All right," she agreed. "I'd like to see Presidio." An hour later, they were riding toward town, Paige seated on a gentle mare named Daisy that Quentin had saddled for her. Her new green dress and a borrowed bonnet gave her a respectable appearance, though she felt exposed after weeks of seclusion. "You ride well," Quentin observed as they traveled side by side. "My father taught me when I was young," Paige replied. "We had an old mare in Missouri that I used to ride to school. I haven't had much chance since we came west, though." "Daisy seems to approve of you," Quentin said, nodding toward the mare who was moving with a contented gait beneath Paige. "She can be picky about her riders." "I'm honored by her approval then," Paige said, patting the horse's neck affectionately. As they approached Presidio, Paige was struck by the bustle of the town. It was considerably larger than the small settlement near her father's homestead, with a proper main street lined with businesses, a church, and even a small hotel. People moved about with purpose, and wagons loaded with goods created a steady stream of traffic. "It's bigger than I expected," Paige commented as they rode down the main street. "Growing fast," Quentin agreed. "The border trade keeps things lively, and there's talk of the railroad coming through eventually." Several people greeted Quentin as they passed, curious eyes taking in Paige at his side. She felt the weight of their gazes but tried to appear composed, reminding herself that no one here knew her story unless Quentin had shared it. They stopped first at the general store, a large establishment with a wide porch and windows displaying everything from fabric to tools. A bell jingled as they entered, and Paige was immediately enveloped by the familiar sense of coffee, leather, and spices that seemed universal to mercantiles across the country. Quentin Hayes. "And this must be Miss Forrest," a plump, gray-haired woman exclaimed, coming around the counter to greet them. "I'm Martha Abernathy, so pleased to finally meet you, my dear." "Likewise, Mrs. Abernathy," Paige replied, finding herself immediately at ease with the woman's motherly manner. "Thank you for the kind offer of employment." "Well, we can discuss that properly when you're ready," Mrs. Abernathy said, patting Paige's hand. "Sarah Wilson says you're still recovering, so no rush, but I must say you look much better than I was led to believe." "Miss Forrest is resilient," Quentin remarked, the pride in his voice causing Paige to blush. They spent nearly an hour at the mercantile, with Quentin gathering supplies while Paige spoke with Mrs. Abernathy about the potential job. By the time they left, Paige had a clearer understanding of what would be expected of her and felt genuinely enthusiastic about the prospect. Their next stop was the sheriff's office, a small but sturdy building near the center of town. Quentin tied their horses outside and turned to Paige. "You don't have to do this today," he said quietly. "We can come back when you feel more prepared." "No, I want to speak with him now," Paige replied, squaring her shoulders. "The sooner he knows about the Callahan's plans, the better." Sheriff Ellis was a tall, lean man with salt and pepper hair and a neatly trimmed mustache. His eyes were sharp, but kind as he welcomed them into his office and listened to Paige's story. She told him everything: the Callahan's interest in her father's land, the overheard conversation about wider plans, and finally, the brutal attack that had left her father dead and her wounded and fleeing for her life. "This fits with other reports I've been hearing," the sheriff said gravely when she had finished. "Homesteaders being pressured to sell, mysterious fires, cattle dying from poisoned water. The Callahans have been spreading their influence throughout the county." "Can you stop them?" Paige asked. Sheriff Ellis sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's not that simple. They're careful, keep themselves at arm's length from the dirty work, and they've got friends in high places: a judge in El Paso, a banker in San Antonio. But your testimony—" He looked at her thoughtfully. "Your testimony could help build a case." "She'd be putting herself at risk," Quentin interjected, his voice tight with concern. "Yes, she would," the sheriff agreed bluntly. "But so is every family with land that the Callahans want." Paige lifted her chin. "I'll do whatever is needed, Sheriff." "They murdered my father in cold blood. They need to be stopped." Sheriff Ellis nodded, respect evident in his gaze. "For now, keep a low profile in town. I'll send word to some contacts I have with the state authorities, see if we can build a stronger case. And I'll keep an eye out for any sign the Callahans know you survived." As they left the sheriff's office, Paige felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Speaking about the attack had been painful, but there was also a sense of purpose in knowing she was taking action against her father's killers. "You did well in there," Quentin said as they untied their horses. "Not everyone would have the courage to speak up." "I keep thinking about other families," Paige replied, accepting his help to mount Daisy. Other daughters who might lose their fathers if the Callahans aren't stopped. Quentin's eyes softened as he looked up at her. You're a remarkable woman, Paige Forrest. The use of her first name sent a small thrill through her. It was the first time he had addressed her so informally, and the sound of it in his deep voice made her heart beat a little faster. They spent the rest of the morning exploring Presidio, with Quentin pointing out various establishments and introducing Paige to several townspeople. By the time they stopped for lunch at the hotel restaurant, Paige was feeling more comfortable in the town that might soon become her home. So what do you think of Presidio? Quentin asked as they were served bowls of hearty stew and fresh bread. I like it, Paige replied honestly. It feels alive, like a place where I might find my feet again. The people are good for the most part, Quentin said. They look out for each other. They seem to respect you a great deal, Paige observed. Everyone we've met has been so welcoming simply because I'm with you. Quentin shrugged, looking somewhat embarrassed. I've lived here 5 years, helped a few folks out from time to time. More than a few, I'd wager, Paige said with a small smile. She had noticed the way people deferred to him, the way they spoke his name with a mixture of respect and affection. Clearly, there was more to Quentin Hayes than the solitary rancher he portrayed himself to be. As they were finishing their meal, the restaurant door opened, and a well-dressed man entered, accompanied by 2 rough-looking companions. The atmosphere in the room immediately tensed, conversations faltering as people cast wary glances toward the newcomers. Quentin's posture changed subtly, his relaxed demeanor giving way to alertness. We should go, he said quietly to Paige. Who is that? Paige asked, keeping her voice low. Victor Callahan, Quentin replied, the name sending a chill through Paige. The youngest of the Callahan brothers. Paige felt the blood drain from her face. He'll recognize me, she whispered, fighting the panic rising in her chest. He was there that night. Keep your head down, Quentin instructed calmly. I'll get you out of here. But it was too late. Victor Callahan's gaze swept the room and settled on their table. A flicker of recognition crossed his face as he looked at Paige, his eyes narrowing in calculation. Well, he drawled, changing direction to approach them. What have we here? Quentin Hayes dining with a lovely lady. That's not something you see every day in Presidio. Quentin rose slowly to his feet, his body positioned to shield Paige. Callahan, he acknowledged with a curt nod. We were just leaving. So soon. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes, but I haven't had the pleasure of meeting your companion. Paige kept her gaze fixed on the table, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Her mind raced with terror had he recognized her. Did he know she was the woman who had escaped that night? She's not feeling well, Quentin said, his voice hard. Excuse us. He reached for Paige's hand, helping her to her feet while keeping himself between her and Callahan. As they moved toward the door, Victor stepped slightly to the side, trying to get a better look at Paige's face. Have we met before, miss? He asked, his tone deceptively pleasant. You seem familiar. Paige found her voice pitching it slightly higher than normal. I don't believe so, sir. I'm new to the area, Victor hummed thoughtfully, his eyes calculating. Is that so? Where are you from, if I might ask? Before Paige could answer, the restaurant door opened again and Sheriff Ellis entered. He took in the scene at a glance and moved toward them. Callahan, he greeted, his hand resting casually on his holstered pistol. Didn't expect to see you in Presidio today. Just passing through, Sheriff, Victor replied smoothly, though his eyes remained on Paige. Business in El Paso. Well, don't let me keep you from your meal, the sheriff said pointedly. Hayes, Miss Forrest, I believe you were on your way out. The use of her real name sent a jolt of fear through Paige, but she kept her expression neutral as Quentin guided her past Callahan and toward the door. She could feel Victor's gaze boring into her back as they left, the weight of it like a physical threat. Once outside, Quentin moved quickly, leading Paige toward their horses. We need to get you back to the ranch, he said, his voice tight with urgency. He recognized me, Paige said, her voice shaking. Not completely, but he suspects. Sheriff Ellis shouldn't have used your name, Quentin muttered, helping her onto Daisy with more haste than care. That was careless. Or deliberate, Paige suggested, a terrible thought occurring to her. What if the Callahans have influence here too? What if the sheriff is— No, Quentin cut her off. Not Ellis. I've known him for years. He's a good man. But doubt had crept into his voice. They rode out of town at a brisk pace, Quentin constantly checking behind them for signs of pursuit. Paige's mind raced with the implications of the encounter. If Victor Callahan connected her to the woman who had escaped that night, who had shot one of his men, her life wouldn't be worth a Confederate dollar. "What do we do now?" she asked as they reached the turnoff to Quentin's ranch. Quentin's expression was grim. "We prepare. If Callahan suspects who you are, he'll come looking, but he won't find you unprotected this time." The determination in his voice gave Paige courage, even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Quentin Hayes had promised to stand with her, and somehow that made all the difference back at the ranch. Quentin wasted no time in preparing for potential trouble. He checked and cleaned his rifles, made sure the doors and windows were secure, and saddled 2 horses that he kept in the barn, ready for a quick departure if necessary. "You think they'll come tonight?" Paige asked, watching as Quentin loaded his Colt revolver. "Hard to say," he replied. "Victor's not the type to act rashly. He'll want to be sure before he makes a move." He looked up at her. "But we'll be ready regardless." As evening fell, they sat down to a simple dinner, though neither had much appetite. The carefree day they had begun in town seemed a distant memory now, replaced by a tense vigil. "I'm sorry," Paige said softly as she pushed food around her plate. "I've brought danger to your door." Quentin looked up sharply. "This isn't your fault, Paige. The Callahans are the ones who chose violence. You're just trying to survive." "But now you're involved too," she insisted. "They could hurt you because of me." A hint of a smile touched Quentin's lips. "I've dealt with worse than the Callahans in my time, and some things are worth the risk." Their eyes met across the table, and in that moment, Paige understood that he wasn't just talking about standing against injustice. There was something deeper in his gaze, something that made her breath catch and her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. Quentin was on his feet instantly, moving to the window to peer out into the gathering darkness. 3 riders, he reported, his voice calm but tense. "Coming up the main trail, Callahan?" Paige asked, rising from her chair. "Can't tell yet," Quentin replied, "but we should assume the worst." He turned to her. "Take this," he said, offering her a small revolver. "Do you know how to use it?" Paige took the gun, feeling its weight in her hand. "My father taught me, but I've only fired one once before." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew when that had been. "I'm going to try to talk to them first," Quentin said, checking his own weapon. "But if things go wrong, I want you to slip out the back and head for the creek. Follow it downstream, away from town. There's a line shack about 3 miles down where you can hide." "I'm not leaving you to face them alone," Paige protested. Quentin's expression softened. "I appreciate the sentiment, but I need to know you're safe. That's what matters most." Before Paige could argue further, the sound of horses stopping outside the house reached them. A moment later, a voice called out, "Hayes, we know you're in there. Send out the woman and we'll be on our way." Paige's blood ran cold at the familiar voice. Victor Callahan. Quentin moved to the door, positioning himself so he could speak without being fully exposed. "This is private property, Callahan. You're not welcome here." "Don't make this difficult, Hayes," Victor called back. "The woman is wanted for murder, one of my men. She shot him during a legal dispute over land." "Legal dispute?" Quentin's voice dripped with contempt. "Is that what you call murdering her father and burning their home?" There was a pause, then Victor's voice again, harder now. "So she has been filling your head with lies." "The girl's not right in the mind, Hayes. Her father attacked my men and she shot one of them in the back. We're just here to bring her to justice." Paige stepped closer to Quentin, her hand on his arm. "He's trying to goad you," she whispered. Quentin nodded slightly in acknowledgement. "You have no authority here, Callahan," he called out. If you have charges to bring, take them to Sheriff Ellis. Ellis isn't here, Victor replied, and I'm growing impatient. Send her out now or we're coming in to get her. That would be a mistake, Quentin said, his voice deadly calm. For a tense moment, silence hung in the air. Then, without warning, a shot rang out, splintering the wood beside the door. Quentin pushed Paige down and away from the entrance, returning fire through the window. The night erupted in gunfire, bullets tearing through the wooden walls of the house as Quentin moved from window to window, firing back at their attackers. Paige crouched behind an overturned table, her heart pounding as splinters and dust filled the air. They're trying to flank us, Quentin called to her. We need to move, head for the barn, I'll cover you. Paige hesitated, terrified of leaving the relative safety of the house, but another volley of gunfire decided for her. She scrambled to the back door, revolver clutched in her shaking hand. Now, Quentin shouted, firing rapidly through the front window. Paige burst through the back door and ran for the barn, her lungs burning as she sprinted across the open ground. She could hear shouts behind her, then more gunfire. As she reached the barn door, a bullet splintered the wood beside her head, sending her diving inside. Quentin appeared moments later, backing through the doorway with his rifle raised. "Get the horses," he ordered, firing once more before shutting the barn door and barring it. Paige hurried to where the two saddled horses waited, her hands fumbling with the reins. Outside, she could hear men approaching the barn, their voices low and menacing. "Here," Quentin said, taking the reins from her trembling fingers. "I'll lead, you follow." "We'll go out the back, through the creek. The water will hide our tracks." "What about your home?" Paige asked, staring at him in anguish. "Everything you've built here, it's just things," Quentin replied, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light of the barn. "They can be replaced." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. "You can't." The tenderness of the gesture, even in the midst of danger, brought tears to Paige's eyes. This man, who had saved her life in the desert, was now willing to sacrifice everything he had built to protect her again. A crash against the barn door broke the moment. "They're coming through," Quentin said, helping Paige onto her horse. "Stay close to me and don't look back." He mounted his own horse and led the way to the rear of the barn, where a small door opened onto a path that wound down toward the creek. As they slipped out into the night, the sounds of the barn door splintering echoed behind them. They rode hard through the darkness, Quentin leading them along the creek bed, where the water would hide their tracks. The moon was just rising, casting enough light to see by but not enough to make them easy targets. Behind them, Paige could hear shouts of anger as their escape was discovered, then the distant sound of horses giving chase. "They'll expect us to head for town," Quentin called over his shoulder. "We're going the opposite direction, into the hills. I know places they won't find us." Paige focused on staying in the saddle, her shoulder aching from the exertion and the still healing wound. Fear drove her forward, but there was something else too, a fierce determination that had been growing within her since the moment Quentin had found her in the desert. She refused to be a victim again. She refused to let the Callahans take another life from her. For hours they rode, following trails that seemed invisible to Paige's eyes, but that Quentin navigated with confidence. The night grew colder as they climbed higher into the hills, the desert giving way to scrub and then scattered pine trees. Eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded entirely, but Quentin didn't slow their pace. "Are they still following?" Paige asked during a brief rest to water the horses at a small spring. "Probably not this far," Quentin replied, scanning the darkness behind them. "But Victor Callahan isn't a man who gives up easily. He'll have men watching the roads, the trails back to town." "What will we do?" Quentin handed her his canteen. "There's a place about 2 hours from here, an old mining cabin that belonged to a friend who died in the war. Few people know about it. We'll be safe there while we figure out our next move." "And then?" Paige asked, the reality of their situation sinking in. "We can't run forever." "No," Quentin agreed, his expression grim in the moonlight. "We can't, but right now we need distance and time." They mounted again and continued their journey, the terrain growing steeper and more rugged. Despite her exhaustion, Paige couldn't help but be struck by the wild beauty around them, the moonlight silvering the landscape, the vast canopy of stars overhead, the profound silence broken only by the sound of their horses' hooves. It was well past midnight when they finally reached the cabin, a small, sturdy structure nestled against a rocky hillside. It was simple but well built, with a stone chimney and shuttered windows. "It's not much," Quentin said as he helped Paige dismount, "but it's solid and hidden. We should be safe here." Inside, the cabin was dusty but intact. A table, 2 chairs, a small stove, and a narrow bed were the only furnishings. Quentin lit a lamp he found on the table, casting a warm glow over the sparse interior. "You take the bed," he said, reaching for blankets stored in a trunk. "I'll keep watch." Paige shook her head. "You need rest too, we can take turns." Quentin looked like he might argue but then nodded. "All right, you sleep first, I'll wake you in a few hours." Despite her exhaustion, Paige was reluctant to lie down. The events of the day swirled in her mind: the peaceful morning in town, the terrifying encounter with Victor Callahan, the shootout at the ranch, and now this desperate flight into the hills. And through it all, Quentin's unwavering presence, his determination to protect her at any cost. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, the question that had been building inside her finally spilling out. "Why risk everything for me?" Quentin, who had been checking the windows, turned to face her. In the lamplight, his features were cast in shadow, but his eyes were clear and direct. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "There's more to it than that," Paige insisted, taking a step toward him. "No one risks their life, their home, for a stranger just because it's right." Quentin was silent for a long moment, his gaze never leaving her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "You're not a stranger to me, Paige, not anymore." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Paige's heart quickened as Quentin took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "From the moment I found you in that desert, something changed," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told myself I was just doing what any decent man would do, but the truth is—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "The truth is, I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you." Paige's breath caught in her throat. "And how do you feel?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Instead of answering with words, Quentin reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, his hand cupped her cheek, his touch gentle as his thumb traced the curve of her face. "Like I've found something I didn't even know I was looking for," he murmured. "Something worth any risk." Paige leaned into his touch, her own hand rising to cover his. "I felt dead inside after what happened," she admitted softly. "Like everything that mattered had been burned away with my home. But then you found me and you said I was worth saving." Her voice broke, and I started to believe it might be true. Quentin's gaze softened, the tenderness in his eyes nearly undoing her. "It is true, Paige, more true than anything I know." Slowly, giving her every chance to step away, he leaned down toward her. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened as Paige responded, her arms sliding around his neck as she pressed closer to him. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "I should let you rest," he said, though he made no move to release her from his embrace. "Stay with me," Paige whispered, the words carrying a vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to show until now. "Just hold me tonight," Quentin nodded, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Always." That night they lay together on the narrow bed, Paige's head resting on Quentin's chest, his arms encircling her protectively. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to the moon. But within the cabin's walls, for the first time since the night her world had been destroyed, Paige felt completely safe. As she drifted toward sleep, she realized that Quentin had been right that day in the desert. She had been worth saving. And somehow, against all odds, She had found not just safety but the promise of something she had thought forever lost to her, a future, a home, and a love that had the power to heal even the deepest wounds. Dawn broke over the hills, sending shafts of golden light through the cabin's single window. Paige woke slowly, momentarily disoriented until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She was alone in the bed, but the sound of movement outside told her where Quentin was. She rose and went to the door, opening it to find him tending to the horses, his back to her as he checked their legs for signs of strain after the hard ride. The morning light caught in his dark hair, highlighting strands of silver at his temples that she hadn't noticed before. "Good morning," she called softly. He turned, and the smile that spread across his face at the sight of her made her heart skip a beat. "Morning," he replied, straightening up. "Sleep well." "Better than I expected," Paige admitted, stepping out onto the small porch. The air was crisp and clear, the view from their hillside position revealing miles of rugged country stretching toward the distant desert floor. "It's beautiful up here." "It is," Quentin agreed, coming to stand beside her. "My friend used to say this was where heaven touched earth." "Your friend had a poet's soul," Paige said, enjoying the tranquility of the moment despite the circumstances that had brought them here. "Did you find what you were looking for out here last night?" "I was making sure we weren't followed," Quentin explained, "and thinking about our next steps." The reminder of their situation sobered Paige instantly. "Do you think the Callahans will keep looking for us?" "For a time," Quentin replied honestly. "Victor isn't a man who takes defiance lightly, but he can't search these hills forever. Eventually, he'll return to his other business." "But we can't stay hidden up here indefinitely either," Paige pointed out. "No, we can't." Quentin leaned against the porch railing, his expression thoughtful. "We have a few options. We could try to reach the railroad at Marathon, head east or north, start fresh somewhere the Callahans have no influence." "Run away, you mean," Paige said, a note of bitterness creeping into her voice. "Or," Quentin continued, "we can try to find a way to stop them. Permanently." Paige looked at him sharply. "How?" "The information you overheard about their plans, it could be enough to build a case against them, especially if we can find others willing to testify about their experiences with the Callahans." Quentin straightened, his expression determined. "But it would mean going back, facing them again. It would be dangerous." "Staying quiet is dangerous too," Paige replied. "They'll keep hurting people, taking what they want." She took a deep breath. "I want to fight, Quentin. I want justice for my father, for all the others they've harmed." Pride flickered in Quentin's eyes. "I thought you might say that. There's a U.S. Marshal I know stationed in El Paso. He's been trying to build a case against the Callahans for months. With your testimony and my support, he might have enough to move against them." "El Paso is at least 3 days' ride," Paige calculated, "and we'd have to avoid the Callahans' men on the way." 4 days the route we'd have to take," Quentin corrected. "Through the mountains, staying off the main trails, it won't be easy." Paige met his gaze steadily. "Nothing worth doing ever is." A slow smile spread across Quentin's face. "No, it isn't." He reached out, taking her hand in his. "We'll need supplies. I have a friend about half a day's ride from here, a sheep rancher named Diego Mendoza. He's no friend to the Callahans. He'll help us." "When do we leave?" Paige asked. "As soon as possible," Quentin replied. "The longer we wait, the more time the Callahans have to search." They spent the next hour preparing for the journey, gathering what few supplies were in the cabin and readying the horses. As they worked, Paige found herself stealing glances at Quentin, still hardly believing the turn their relationship had taken. In the midst of danger, something beautiful had blossomed between them, something that gave her the strength to face whatever lay ahead. Just before they were ready to depart, Quentin stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Paige," he said, his voice serious, "I need you to know something. What I said last night about how I feel about you, it wasn't just the heat of the moment. It's real." Paige looked up at him, her heart full. "I know," she said softly. "It's real for me too." "If we do this, if we go against the Callahans, there's no telling how it will end," Quentin warned. "I need to be sure you understand the risk." I understand, Paige replied, but some things are worth the risk. She smiled up at him, using his own words. You taught me that. Quentin's expression softened and he leaned down to kiss her, a brief but tender touch that carried the promise of more to come. Then let's ride, he said when they parted. We have a long journey ahead. They set out from the cabin under the mid-morning sun, Quentin leading the way along narrow trails that wound through the hills. The terrain was challenging, with steep inclines and rocky passages that required their full attention, but Quentin navigated with the confidence of someone who knew the land intimately. How did you learn these trails? Paige asked during a brief stop to rest the horses. After the war, I spent a lot of time in these hills, Quentin replied, his gaze distant. I wasn't fit for company then. The things I'd seen, the things I'd done, they haunted me. So I wandered, learned every trail, every hidden spring. It was a kind of healing, I suppose. And then you became a ranger, Paige prompted, eager to understand more of his past. Quentin nodded. Captain Burton found me half-starved in a line shack during a blizzard. Instead of leaving me to my misery, he dragged me back to the ranger outpost, sobered me up, and offered me a purpose. Said I could keep running from my demons or I could use what I knew to help others. A faint smile touched his lips. Wasn't much of a choice the way he put it. He sounds like a good man, Paige said. The best I've known, Quentin agreed. Taught me that the past doesn't define a man, it's what he does with the life he has left that matters. He met her gaze. That's what I was trying to tell you that day in the desert. Your worth isn't determined by what happened to you, but by who you choose to be from this day forward. Paige felt the truth of his words resonate within her. I'm choosing to be someone who doesn't run, she said softly. Someone who stands and fights for what's right. Then we're well matched, Quentin replied, pride evident in his voice. Because that's the kind of woman I've been falling in love with. The word love hung between them, powerful and transformative. Paige's heart swelled with emotion as she realized that this man, this honorable, strong, gentle man, had given her not just safety but the most precious gift of all. The belief that she was worthy of love, even after everything she had lost. They continued their journey, the sun climbing higher in the sky as they made their way toward Diego Mendoza's sheep ranch. By mid-afternoon, they had descended from the higher elevations into rolling grassland dotted with oak trees and crossed by clear streams. We're getting close, Quentin said as they forded a small creek. Mendoza's ranch is just beyond that ridge. The sheep ranch, when they reached it, was a modest but well-maintained property with a small adobe house, several outbuildings and corrals filled with woolly sheep. As they approached, a man emerged from the house, a rifle in his hands until he recognized Quentin. Hayes, he called in a voice rich with a Spanish accent. What brings you to my humble home? Quentin dismounted, approaching the man with an extended hand. Trouble, I'm afraid, Diego. This is Miss Paige Forrest. We need your help. Diego Mendoza was a middle-aged man with a weathered face, keen dark eyes, and a ready smile that showed despite the serious nature of their visit. He welcomed them into his home, where his wife, Elena, immediately set about preparing food for them while Diego listened to their story. The Callahans, he spat when Quentin finished explaining their situation. They have tried to force me to sell my land 3 times. When I refused, my best ram was found with his throat cut. A warning, they said. His eyes filled with sympathy as he looked at Paige. I am sorry for your father, señorita. He was a brave man to stand against such monsters. Then you'll help us? Quentin asked. Of course, my friend, Diego replied without hesitation. My home is your home. You may rest here tonight, and tomorrow I will give you supplies for your journey to El Paso. That evening, after a meal that reminded Paige how long it had been since she'd enjoyed home-cooked food prepared by a skilled hand, Diego and Elena showed them to a small guest room with a clean, comfortable bed. I'm afraid we have only the one room, Elena apologized, a knowing twinkle in her eye as she glanced between Paige and Quentin. But perhaps that is not a problem, Paige felt her cheeks warm, but Quentin merely thanked their hosts with a dignity that made her love him even more. When they were alone, Quentin immediately moved toward a chair in the corner. "I'll sleep here," he said. "You take the bed." "Quentin," Paige said softly, stepping toward him. "After last night, I thought—" She trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Quentin's expression softened as he reached for her hands. "Last night was—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "It meant everything to me, Paige, but I don't want you to feel that anything is expected. We're in a desperate situation, emotions are high, this isn't about desperation," Paige interrupted, squeezing his hands. "What I feel for you is real. It would be real even if we weren't running for our lives." The tension eased from Quentin's shoulders and he drew her closer. "I've been alone a long time," he admitted. "I wasn't looking for this for you, but now that I've found you, I can't imagine my life without you in it." "Then don't try," Paige whispered, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. The kiss deepened quickly, both of them pouring the fear and hope of the past days into the connection. Quentin's arms encircled her, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, and in that moment, Paige believed she truly might be at least to him. When they finally parted, breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens in El Paso, whatever comes next," he murmured, "I want you to know that finding you that day in the desert was the best thing that ever happened to me." "Even though it led to gunfights and fleeing your home?" Paige asked, half teasing. "Even then," Quentin confirmed with absolute seriousness. "Some prices are worth paying for the right treasure." As they settled into bed together, Paige's head resting on Quentin's chest, his arms wrapped securely around her, she marveled at the strange path her life had taken. From the depths of despair in that desert, convinced she wasn't worth saving, to this moment of profound connection with a man who saw her value so clearly. It wasn't just that Quentin had rescued her. He had helped her find the strength to rescue herself, to believe in her own worth again. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, the words coming naturally, without fear or hesitation. His arms tightened around her, and she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. "And I love you, Paige Forrest," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible." In that moment, despite the danger that still lay ahead, despite the uncertain future they faced, Paige knew with absolute certainty that she had found her home not in a place, but in the heart of the man who had refused to leave her to die in the desert because he believed she was worth saving. They left the Mendoza ranch at dawn the next morning, their saddlebags filled with provisions and their spirits bolstered by the friendship and support they had received. Diego had provided them with detailed directions for the safest route to El Paso, avoiding the main trails where the Callahans might have men watching. "It will take you through some rough country," Diego warned as they prepared to depart, "but Hayes knows these lands well. Trust his judgment." "I do," Paige replied, the simple statement carrying deeper meaning than the rancher could know. Elena pressed a small package into Paige's hands just before they left. "Herbs," she explained with a sympathetic smile, "for pain, for healing. The journey will not be easy on your shoulder." "Thank you," Paige said, touched by the woman's thoughtfulness, "for everything." "Be careful, my friends," Diego called as they rode away, "and may God go with you." The first day of their journey passed without incident, taking them through rolling hills and grasslands where they could move at a good pace. Quentin was vigilant, frequently stopping to scan their back trail and survey the terrain ahead, but there was no sign of pursuit. "Do you think we've lost them?" Paige asked as they made camp that evening in a small grove of cottonwoods beside a stream. "For now, maybe," Quentin replied, building a small, smokeless fire. "But Victor Callahan isn't a man to give up easily. He'll have men watching the approaches to El Paso." "Then we'll have to be more careful as we get closer," Paige said, setting out the food Elena had packed for them. "Diego said we should reach the Rio Grande by tomorrow evening, if we keep this pace, yes." Quentin sat beside her, accepting a plate of beans and dried meat. "Once we cross the river, we'll be in the shadow of the mountains. The terrain gets rougher, but it also offers more places to hide. They ate in comfortable silence, the soft sounds of the stream and the occasional call of a night bird the only interruptions. After dinner, they sat side by side, shoulders touching, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "I've been thinking," Quentin said finally, his voice thoughtful. "About what comes after." "After?" Paige echoed. "After El Paso, after we give our testimony to Marshal Bennett." He turned to look at her, his face serious in the firelight. "If things go as we hope, if Bennett can build a case against the Callahans, it won't be resolved quickly. Legal proceedings take time, and even if the Callahans are arrested, they have friends who might still pose a danger." Paige nodded slowly, understanding his concern. "You're saying we might not be able to go back to Presidio right away?" "Or at all," Quentin admitted. "My ranch may not be there to return to in any case. The Callahans aren't known for their restraint when crossed." The thought of Quentin's home, the place where she had begun to heal, where they had first connected, being destroyed, caused a pang in Paige's heart. "I'm so sorry, Quentin, everything you've worked for." "It's just a place," Quentin interrupted gently. "What matters is that we're together. Wherever we end up." The simple declaration, so matter-of-fact, so certain, took Paige's breath away. "Together," she repeated softly. "You still want that, even after all the trouble I've brought into your life?" Quentin's hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "Paige," he said, his voice low and intense, "meeting you is the best thing that ever happened to me. Not despite the danger, but because of who you are, your courage, your heart. I've spent 5 years living half a life, going through the motions. Then you appeared, saying you weren't worth saving, and suddenly I had a purpose again." Tears pricked at Paige's eyes. "You gave me back my life," she whispered. "Not just by rescuing me that day, but by making me believe I deserved to be rescued." "We rescued each other," Quentin replied, raising their joined hands to press a kiss to her knuckles. "And whatever comes next, we'll face it together." "Together," Paige agreed, the word a promise and a prayer. They slept beneath the stars that night, wrapped in blankets and each other's arms, the small fire burning down to embers beside them. Despite the hard ground and the cool night air, Paige slept deeply, secure in Quentin's embrace and the love that had grown between them against all odds. The next day brought them to more challenging terrain as they approached the Rio Grande. The land grew increasingly rugged, with steep ravines and rocky outcroppings that slowed their progress. By mid-afternoon, they could see the river in the distance, a silver ribbon winding through the landscape. "There's a ford about 2 miles downstream," Quentin said as they paused on a ridge to survey the area. Not well known, used mostly by, he broke off suddenly, his posture tensing as he focused on something in the distance. "What is it?" Paige asked, immediately alert. "Riders," Quentin said grimly, pointing to a dust cloud visible far to the east, coming fast along the river road. Paige felt a chill of fear. "The Callahans? Can't be sure from this distance, but we can't take the chance." Quentin turned to her, his expression resolute. "We need to move now, get across the river before they spot us." They urged their horses down the ridge, moving as quickly as the rocky terrain would allow. Paige could feel the tension radiating from Quentin as they rode, his eyes constantly scanning for danger. The peaceful journey of the previous day seemed a distant memory now, as the reality of their situation pressed in upon them once more. They reached the river, as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. The ford Quentin had mentioned was a shallow stretch where the river widened, the water flowing clear over a rocky bed. On the far side, steep hills rose toward the mountains that formed the backdrop to El Paso. "Stay close," Quentin instructed as they guided their horses into the water. "The current's stronger than it looks." The river was cold, the water reaching nearly to their horses' bellies at the deepest point. Halfway across, Paige's mare balked, frightened by the rushing water. As she struggled to control the nervous animal, a sound carried to them over the noise of the river the distant but unmistakable report of a rifle, followed by the splash of a bullet striking the water nearby. "They've seen us," Quentin shouted, reaching over to grab the reins of Paige's horse. "Come on!" They pushed forward, the horses struggling against the current as more shots rang out behind them. Paige kept low in the saddle, her heart pounding with fear as bullets sprayed the water around them. Just as they reached the far bank, she felt a sharp impact, like being struck by a hammer, and cried out as pain exploded in her side. "Paige!" Quentin's voice seemed to come from far away as darkness threatened at the edges of her vision. She felt herself slipping from the saddle, strong arms catching her before she could fall into the river. "I'm hit," she managed to say, her voice faint even to her own ears. Quentin lifted her onto his own horse, mounting behind her and holding her upright as he urged both horses up the bank and into the shelter of the trees beyond. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, men shouting, horses splashing through the river, but Paige was only vaguely aware of it as pain consumed her consciousness. "Stay with me, Paige." Quentin's voice was fierce in her ear as they rode hard through the trees. "Don't you dare give up on me now. Not." "Giving up," she gasped, fighting to stay conscious. "Just hurts." "I know, sweetheart, I know, but we need to find shelter somewhere I can look at that wound. Just hold on a little longer." Time seemed to stretch and contract as they rode, Paige focusing all her energy on staying awake, on breathing through the pain that radiated from her side with each movement of the horse. She was vaguely aware of Quentin guiding them deeper into the hills, away from their pursuers, his body solid and warm against her back, his voice a constant reassurance in her ear. Eventually, they came to a small canyon where a stream cut through the rock. Quentin followed it upstream to where an overhang created a natural shelter, hidden from view by dense brush. "Here," he said, bringing the horses to a halt. "They won't find us easily here." He dismounted carefully, lifting Paige down with gentle hands. She cried out as the movement jarred her wound, black spots dancing before her eyes. "I'm sorry," Quentin murmured, laying her on the ground beneath the overhang. "I need to look at that wound now." Paige nodded weakly, gritting her teeth as Quentin carefully unbuttoned her bloodied shirt to expose the injury. His sharp intake of breath told her it was bad before he spoke. "The bullet's still in there," he said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "But it doesn't look like it hit anything vital. You're losing blood, though, Elena's." "Herbs," Paige managed to say. "In my saddlebag." Quentin found the package quickly, unwrapping it to reveal several small pouches with handwritten labels. One was marked Para Sangrado for bleeding. "Thank God for Elena," he muttered as he took a canteen and tore a strip from his own shirt. "This is going to hurt, Paige. I'm sorry." The pain as he cleaned and packed the wound had Paige biting her lip until she tasted blood, tears streaming from her eyes despite her efforts to be brave. Quentin worked as gently as he could, his hands steady but his face contorted with shared pain as he tended to her injury. "The bullet needs to come out," he said when he had finished bandaging her. "But I can't do it here, not safely. We need to get you to El Paso to a proper doctor." "How far?" Paige asked, her voice faint. "Still a day's ride, at least," Quentin replied, his expression grim. "And we can't move until we're sure the Callahans have lost our trail." He settled beside her, cradling her upper body in his arms so that her head rested against his chest. "Rest now," he said softly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'll keep watch." Paige wanted to protest, to insist she was fine, but the pain and blood loss had left her too weak to argue. She let her eyes close, taking comfort in the steady beat of Quentin's heart beneath her ear and the protective circle of his arms around her. "Don't leave me," she whispered as consciousness began to slip away. "Never," Quentin promised, his voice fierce with conviction. "Not for anything in this world." Night fell over the canyon, the temperature dropping rapidly as darkness claimed the land. Quentin dared not light a fire, fearing it would give away their position to the Callahans who were surely still searching for them. Instead, he wrapped Paige in both their blankets and held her close, sharing his body heat to ward off the chill. Paige drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring in her sleep, sometimes waking with a gasp of pain. Each time Quentin was there, his voice steady and reassuring, offering water or a few of Alina's herbs to ease her discomfort. He could feel fever beginning to build in her body, a heat that had nothing to do with the blankets or his embrace. Fear gnawed at him as the hours passed. He had seen men die from wounds like Paige's, not from the bullet itself, but from the infection that followed. They needed to reach El Paso, needed a doctor who could remove the bullet and properly clean the wound. But moving her now, while the Callahans were still searching the area, would be dangerous. And yet waiting too long could be just as deadly. It was a cruel choice, and one that Quentin had never felt less prepared to make. In his years as a ranger, he had made life-or-death decisions countless times, always with a clear head and steady hand. But this was different. This was Paige, the woman he loved, the woman who had brought light back into his life when he had thought it forever extinguished. "I can't lose you," he whispered into her hair as she slept fitfully in his arms. "Not when I've just found you." As if in response to his voice, Paige stirred, her eyes fluttering open to look up at him with a clarity that surprised him, given her condition. "You won't lose me," she said softly. "I'm stronger than I look." Quentin managed to smile, though his heart ached with worry. "I know you are, strongest woman I've ever met." "We need to keep moving," Paige continued, her voice gaining strength as she fully awakened. "The Callahans won't give up." "You're in no condition to ride," Quentin protested. "The fever's setting in and that bullet needs to come out." "Then take it out," Paige said simply. Quentin stared at her. "Here, now, Paige, I'm no doctor." "The risk is no greater than waiting until infection takes hold completely," she interrupted. "My father removed a bullet from a neighbor once. I watched him. You need to heat your knife, get the bullet, then cauterize the wound." The thought of causing her such pain was almost unbearable to Quentin, but he knew she was right. Every hour they delayed increased the danger from infection. "All right," he said finally. "But not here. We'll move deeper into the canyon where I can risk a small fire." It took nearly an hour to find a suitable location, a small clearing surrounded by high rock walls that would shield the light of a fire from distant observers. By the time Quentin had made Paige as comfortable as possible and gathered wood for a fire, her fever had risen noticeably, her skin hot to the touch and her eyes bright with pain. "Alina's herbs," she reminded him as he hesitated, the knife in his hand. "There should be something for pain." Quentin found the pouch labeled $1 and mixed some of the dried herbs with water as Alina had instructed Sarah to explain to them. The bitter tea took some time to have an effect, but eventually, Paige's features relaxed slightly as the herbal remedy dulled the worst of her pain. "Do it now," she urged, her voice steadier than it had been. "While the herbs are working," Quentin nodded, placing his knife in the heart of the small fire he had built. As it heated, he prepared the rest of what he would need: clean cloths, water, more of Alina's herbs for bleeding and infection. When the blade glowed red-hot, he took a deep breath to steady his hands. "Ready?" he asked, kneeling beside Paige. She nodded, taking a thick piece of leather he offered and placing it between her teeth. Their eyes met for a long moment, hers filled with trust that humbled him to his core. "I love you," he said quietly. "Hold on to that." What followed was the hardest thing Quentin had ever done. Paige's muffled screams as he cut into her wound to extract the bullet tore at his heart, but he forced himself to continue, his hands steady despite the turmoil in his soul. When the bullet finally came free, he worked quickly to clean the wound with water and Alina's herbs, before heating the knife again for the task of cauterizing. The sizzle of hot metal against flesh and Paige's agonized cry would haunt Quentin's dreams for years to come. But it was done, the bullet removed, the bleeding stopped, the wound as clean as he could make it under the circumstances. Paige lay unconscious after the ordeal, her body having mercifully shut down against the pain. Quentin bandaged her carefully, then sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on her forehead to monitor her fever. The night stretched endlessly before him as he maintained his vigil, torn between relief that the immediate danger had passed and fear of what might still come. Dawn found Quentin still awake, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion but fixed with unwavering attention on Paige's face. To his immense relief, her fever seemed to have broken sometime in the early hours of the morning, her breathing easier and her skin cooler to the touch. When she finally opened her eyes, the clarity in them nearly brought tears to his. "You did it," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. "We did it," Quentin corrected, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "You're the bravest person I've ever known, Paige Forrest." A small smile touched her lips. "Does this mean I get to rest while you do all the work for a change?" The attempt at humor, even in her weakened state, filled Quentin's heart with hope. "As long as you need," he promised. "Though we should try to reach El Paso soon, get you to a proper doctor." Paige nodded, her expression growing serious. "The Callahans." "No sign of them since yesterday," Quentin replied. "I think they lost our trail when we crossed the river, but that doesn't mean they've given up." "Then we should move as soon as possible," Paige said, attempting to sit up and wincing at the pain in her side. "Easy," Quentin cautioned, supporting her with gentle hands. "We'll leave when you're ready, not before." They rested through most of the day, Quentin using the time to tend to the horses, replenish their water, and keep watch for any sign of pursuit. By late afternoon, Paige was able to sit up for longer periods and even take a few steps with Quentin's support. "I think I can ride," she said, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Not far, perhaps, but enough to make progress. Quentin studied her carefully. The color had returned to her cheeks, and though she was clearly still in pain, her eyes were clear and determined. He knew better than to argue with that expression. "We'll go slowly," he conceded, "and you'll ride with me where I can keep you steady if need be." As twilight gathered, they set out once more, Paige seated in front of Quentin on his horse, her back against his chest and his arms around her to hold the reins. They led her horse behind them, moving at a cautious pace through the darkening hills. The journey was arduous, each jolt of the horse's movement sending spikes of pain through Paige's wound despite Quentin's efforts to cushion her. But she endured without complaint, drawing strength from his presence, and the knowledge that each mile brought them closer to safety. They traveled through the night, stopping only for brief rests when Paige's pain became too intense to continue. By dawn, the lights of El Paso were visible in the distance, the city nestled where the Rio Grande curved between the mountains. "We made it," Paige murmured, leaning more heavily against Quentin as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. "Almost," Quentin replied, his voice tight with concern at her weakened state. "Just a little further, sweetheart. Hold on a little longer." The sun was fully above the horizon when they finally reached the outskirts of El Paso. The city was already bustling with activity, wagons and riders moving along the streets, the sounds of commerce and conversation filling the air. Quentin guided their horse directly to a modest building with a sign identifying it as the office of Dr. Michael Harrison. The doctor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, took one look at Paige and immediately cleared his examining table. "Bullet wound?" he asked as Quentin carried Paige inside. "Yes," Quentin replied. "I removed the bullet yesterday, but she needs proper care." Dr. Harrison raised an eyebrow at this but made no comment as he began to examine Paige's wound. "You did a remarkably clean job," he said finally. "Though I'll need to clean it again and stitch it properly. She's lucky no sign of serious infection yet." "Will she be all right?" Quentin asked, the question that had been burning in his mind since the moment Paige had been shot. The doctor nodded. "With rest and proper care, yes." "She's young and strong." He glanced at Quentin, "and she has someone who cares for her deeply, which often makes all the difference." Relief washed over Quentin like a physical force, nearly buckling his knees. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't thank me yet, doctor." Harrison replied, "I haven't done anything. Now if you'll step outside, I need to tend to your lady." Quentin hesitated, reluctant to leave Paige's side even for a moment. She reached for his hand, giving it a weak squeeze. "I'll be fine," she assured him. "Go, find Marshal Bennett. Tell him our story." After one last look at Paige, Quentin left the doctor's office, his steps determined as he headed for the federal building where Marshal Jedediah Bennett maintained his office. It was time to bring the Callahans to justice, once and for all. Marshal Bennett was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through pretense. He listened without interruption as Quentin related the events of the past weeks, from finding Paige in the desert to their desperate journey to El Paso. "The Callahans," Bennett said when Quentin had finished, the name a curse on his lips. "I've been building a case against them for months. Intimidation, extortion, murder. They've left a trail of broken lives across 3 counties. But witnesses have a way of disappearing or changing their stories when it comes time to testify." "Paige won't change her story," Quentin said with absolute certainty. "She's determined to see justice done, no matter the cost." "And you?" Bennett asked, studying Quentin with those penetrating eyes. "You're willing to stand with her?" "The Callahans have long memories and far-reaching influence. This won't end quickly or cleanly." "I'm with her to the end," Quentin replied without hesitation. "Whatever comes." A hint of a smile crossed the marshal's weathered face. "Thought as much. I remember you from your ranger days, Hayes. You always were one to stand your ground." He leaned forward, his expression turning serious once more. "The woman's testimony, combined with evidence I've already gathered, might be enough to secure indictments, but I won't lie to you, it'll be dangerous. The Callahans won't go down without a fight." "We're already in danger," Quentin pointed out. "At least this way there's a chance to end it permanently." Bennett nodded thoughtfully. "Where is Miss Forrest now?" "Dr. Harrison's office. She was shot during our journey here." Concern flashed across the marshal's face. "The Callahans?" "Yes. They caught up to us at the river crossing." "Then they know you're headed this way," Bennett concluded grimly. "They may already have men in El Paso looking for you." He rose from his desk. "I'll arrange protection for Miss Forrest immediately. And you'll both stay at a safe house until we can secure the indictments and make arrests." The swift response reassured Quentin that they had made the right decision in coming to Bennett. Here, at last, was someone with both the authority and the determination to stand against the Callahans. By the time Quentin returned to Dr. Harrison's office, accompanied by 2 deputy marshals, Paige was resting comfortably on a cot in a back room. Her wound had been properly cleaned and stitched, and though she was pale and weak, the doctor assured Quentin that she was on the road to recovery. "Marshal Bennett is arranging protection for us," Quentin explained as he sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "And a safe place to stay until the indictments are secured." "Then it's really happening," Paige said, a mix of relief and apprehension in her voice. "We're going to bring them to justice." "We are," Quentin confirmed, "together." As evening fell over El Paso, Paige was carefully transferred to the safe house. Bennett had arranged a small but comfortable home on the outskirts of town, guarded by deputy marshals and owned by a retired judge who was no friend to the Callahans. There, for the first time since fleeing Quentin's ranch, they were able to truly rest, secure in the knowledge that they were no longer alone in their fight. In the days that followed, Paige's strength gradually returned as she recuperated from her wound. Marshal Bennett visited regularly, taking her formal statement and updating them on the progress of his investigation. Other witnesses, emboldened by the marshal's protection and Paige's courage, began to come forward with their own accounts of the Callahans' crimes. 2 weeks after their arrival in El Paso, Bennett brought the news they had been waiting for. "The grand jury has returned indictments against Victor Callahan and his brothers for multiple counts of murder, extortion, and land fraud," he announced, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Arrest warrants have been issued and my deputies are moving to execute them as we speak." "All of them?" Paige asked, hardly daring to believe it was finally happening. All of them, Bennett confirmed. And their top lieutenants as well. The syndicate they've built won't survive this. That night, as they sat together on the small porch of the safe house, watching the stars emerge above the mountains, Quentin took Paige's hand in his. "It's almost over," he said softly. "Soon you'll be free to build a new life wherever you choose." Paige turned to look at him, her heart in her eyes. "The only place I want to be is with you, Quentin. Whether that's back in Presidio or somewhere new entirely, I don't care. You're my home now." Quentin's expression softened, love and wonder clear in his gaze. "I never thought I'd find this," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "After the war, I believed that part of me was dead, the part that could love, that could hope for a future beyond just surviving each day. But then you came into my life, insisting you weren't worth saving. And you proved me wrong," Paige finished for him, squeezing his hand. "You saw worth in me when I couldn't see it myself. Just as you saw the man I could be, beyond the solitary rancher with too many ghosts," Quentin replied. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket, withdrawing something small that gleamed in the fading light. "I've been carrying this for days, waiting for the right moment." Paige's breath caught as she realized what he was holding: a simple gold band, modest but beautiful in its unadorned elegance. "It was my mother's," Quentin explained, his voice soft with memory. "The one thing of hers I've kept all these years. She told me once to give it only to the woman who made me whole again." His eyes met Paige's, vulnerable and hopeful. "I can think of no one more deserving than you." Tears filled Paige's eyes as Quentin slid from his chair to kneel before her, the ring held between them like a promise. "Paige Forrest," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you build a new life with me wherever that may lead us?" "Yes," Paige whispered, the word catching on a sob of joy. "Yes, with all my heart." As Quentin slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her carefully into his arms, Paige marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the brink of death in the desert to the threshold of a new beginning, they had traveled a path neither could have imagined. And through it all, they had found in each other not just salvation but a love that transcended the hardships they had faced. "My greatest rescue," Quentin murmured against her hair, echoing the words he had spoken that first day. Then and always. In the months that followed, justice unfolded with a swiftness that surprised even Marshal Bennett. The evidence against the Callahans was overwhelming, strengthened by Paige's testimony and the accounts of other victims who found the courage to come forward. Victor Callahan and his brothers were convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to lengthy terms in the territorial prison. Their empire of intimidation and violence crumbled, leaving the homesteaders and ranchers of the region free from their shadow at last. For Paige and Quentin, the end of the trial brought a decision: where to build their future together. Quentin's ranch near Presidio had indeed been vandalized by the Callahan's men, but not destroyed completely. The house stood, though damaged, and most of his horses had been stolen or scattered. "We could rebuild," Quentin suggested as they rode out to survey the property 3 months after leaving it so hastily. "Start fresh, make it our own." Paige looked around at the land, the hills where they had ridden together, the creek where she had first encountered Quentin's beloved horses, the house where she had begun to heal. Despite the damage, it still felt like a place of beginnings to her. "Yes," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "This is home, or it will be again." They were married the following Sunday in the small church in Presidio, with Doc Wilson officiating and what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Paige wore a simple white dress made by Alina Mendoza, and Quentin stood tall and proud in a new suit, his eyes never leaving her face as they spoke their vows. "I take you as my husband," Paige said, her voice clear and strong, "to stand with through whatever comes, to build a life of purpose and joy, to love until my last breath and beyond." "I take you as my wife," Quentin replied, his hands warm around hers, "to protect and cherish, to walk beside through all of life's journeys, to love with a heart that is fuller for having found you." When Doc Wilson pronounced them husband and wife, and Quentin kissed her with a tenderness that belied the strength of his embrace, Paige felt the last shadows of her past finally lift away. In their place was only light, the promise of a future built on love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for it. The rebuilding of their ranch became a community effort, with neighbors and friends pitching in to repair the house, rebuild the corrals, and even help track down some of Quentin's scattered horses. By the time winter settled over the hills, the Hayes Ranch was once again a place of warmth and life, now filled with the sounds of shared laughter and whispered endearments. In the spring, when the wildflowers bloomed across the hills in a riot of color, Paige shared the news she had been quietly treasuring for weeks. "A child," Quentin repeated, wonder spreading across his face as he laid his hand gently over the still flat expanse of her stomach. "Our child." "Due in the fall," Paige confirmed, her eyes bright with joy. "A new beginning." Quentin gathered her into his arms, his touch reverent. "You continue to be my greatest blessing," he murmured against her temple. "Each day with you is a gift I never thought to have." Their son, Benjamin, was born on a crisp October morning, his lusty cries filling the bedroom where Paige had once recuperated from her own wounds. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's hazel eyes, and from his first breath he was surrounded by love that had been hard-won but was all the more precious for it. As the years passed, the Hayes Ranch prospered. Quentin's skill with horses brought buyers from as far away as San Antonio, and Paige's garden, inspired by her father's teachings, produced bounty that was the envy of neighboring homesteads. Benjamin was joined 2 years later by a sister, Eleanor, and the house that had once known only solitude rang with children's laughter. On the 10th anniversary of the day Quentin had found Paige in the desert, they stood together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set over the hills. "You ever think about it?" Paige asked, leaning into the circle of her husband's arm. "That day when you found me?" "Every day," Quentin replied honestly, pressing a kiss to her hair, now streaked with a few strands of silver. "It was the day my life truly began," Paige smiled, turning in his embrace to look up into the face she had loved through a decade of joys and challenges. The lines around his eyes were deeper now, his hair more liberally sprinkled with gray, but his gaze still held the same steady strength that had given her hope when she had none. "You said I would be your greatest rescue," she reminded him. "Do you still believe that?" Quentin's smile was slow and sure, his eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with the passing years. "No," he said softly, drawing her closer. "Now I know the truth." "And what's that?" Paige asked, her heart still quickening at his touch even after all this time. "That we rescued each other," Quentin replied, bending to touch his forehead to hers. "And we continue to do so every day in all the ways that matter most." As the last light faded from the sky, painting the world in shades of purple and gold, Paige Hayes stood in the arms of the man who had refused to leave her to die in the desert, surrounded by the life they had built together from the ashes of their separate pasts. It was a life richer and more beautiful than she could ever have imagined on that desperate day when she had whispered that she wasn't worth saving. She had been wrong then, gloriously, wonderfully wrong. And in proving it, Quentin Hayes had indeed accomplished his greatest rescue, just as she had become his greatest gift. Together, they had discovered the most profound truth of all, that in saving each other, they had found a love that would endure long after the desert winds had erased their footprints from the sands of time.